7 daughters lie in unmarked graves, their lives stolen and their silence bound by a father's merciless will. Generations later, when the soil shifts and the house awakens, the whispers of the forgotten return, demanding to be heard and refusing to rest. The Fairchild mansion loomed over Blackwood Hollow with a presence that was less architectural than it was spiritual, a structure that seemed less built by men than conjured from the soil itself. The house sat atop the highest ridge of the valley, its jagged silhouette visible for miles, a dark crown against the horizon. By day, its cracked windows caught the light in fractured shards, like broken mirrors that refused to reflect the world truthfully. By night, its chimneys and spires became skeletal, a blacker shade of shadow that drew the eye whether one wanted to look or not. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. Locals called it the house on the hill, though the Fairchild name carried more weight. To speak it aloud was to invite a chill, as though the syllables themselves had grown damp with the mansion's mildew. Children dared one another to climb the slope, to touch the gate that encircled the estate. Few ever did, and those who returned swore the iron burned cold even in summer, a frost that sank through skin and bone. The mansion had stood for nearly a century, its stones quarried from the very earth of Blackwood Hollow, as if Silas Fairchild had meant for his home to be indistinguishable from the land he owned. The ivy, thick and dark as tar, had long since swallowed much of the facade, creeping into cracks, prying apart mortar, dragging the house down even as it clung to keep it upright. Windows wept with streaks of rot, panes warped with age, while inside, shadows stretched too far, refusing to surrender to the glow of candlelight. To those who worked within, the house was not silent, it breathed. The wind that slipped between the rafters whistled like whispers. The settling of the beams groaned like a body shifting in sleep. Some claimed that at certain hours always near midnight the mansion's timbers throbbed faintly, as though the house itself possessed a heartbeat. Servants spoke of cold spots in the corridors, of rooms that smelled faintly of iron, of doors that refused to stay latched even after being bolted shut. The townsfolk of Blackwood Hollow did not question these tales, for they had their own. More than once, a hunter or traveler claimed to see candlelight flickering in the upper windows long after the Fairchilds had ceased to host guests. Others swore they saw pale faces watching from the glass, faces too young, too fragile, and far too many to belong to the household's dwindling number of residents. The church bell tolled differently when its sound passed the Fairchild estate. What should have been a clear bronze chime fractured into a warped resonance, like metal struck off-center. Even animals behaved strangely. Horses balked at the road that curved nearest the hill. Dogs refused to enter the grounds, tails stiff and hackles raised, howling at something their masters could not see. Still, for all its menace, the mansion held a beauty that could not be denied. The grand pillars, streaked though they were with moss and rain, retained their classical dignity. The great double doors, their oak blackened by storms, bore intricate carvings of vines and roses that seemed almost alive under the right slant of light. It was a house designed to impress, to overwhelm, to remind any visitor of the Fairchild's power. And though the family had dwindled, the house still did its work. It was said the mansion kept its secrets the way the grave kept its dead, tight-lipped, unyielding, and without mercy. And like the grave, it drew the living closer, not with welcome, but with warning. For in Blackwood Hollow, no tale was more whispered, more feared, than the one that began with the house on the hill. Silas Fairchild was a man whose very presence seemed carved from the same stone as his mansion. Broad of frame but lean as a pillar, he moved through the halls of Fairchild Estate with the gravity of a magistrate, his boots clicking against marble in a rhythm that announced judgment long before his voice did. He had inherited both wealth and land, but it was not inheritance that defined him, it was control. To speak with Silas was to be weighed, measured, and often found wanting. His gaze was the most remarked upon feature. Heavy, unblinking, and merciless, it was not the look of a father or a husband, but of a sovereign surveying subjects. When Silas's eyes fixed upon someone, words dried in their throats, laughter stuttered into silence, and even the air seemed to stiffen, bracing for impact. He rarely raised his voice, for he had no need. A single glance from him was punishment enough, more binding than chains, more enduring than scars. Silas had been shaped by hardship, though few knew the exact nature of it. Rumors filled the spaces left by silence. Some whispered that he had been a poor boy once, raised in a shack at the edge of Blackwood Hollow, his father a drunkard, his mother too pious for her own survival. Others claimed that Silas had studied law in the city, only to return home with pockets filled by strange benefactors and ambitions too dark to voice aloud. What was certain was that when he came back to the Hollow, he did not come empty-handed. He bought land, timber, and stone, and he built his fortress on the hill with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. The townspeople feared him but depended on him. Silas owned half the valley's mills, controlled the wages of its workers, and manipulated the debts of its shopkeepers with a meticulous ledger no one else dared see. If a man fell behind on his payments, Silas would appear at his door not with threats, but with an offer. Always precise, always binding. No one could say no, for his terms were written with an iron pen, as sharp and unyielding as the man himself. Inside his home, Silas was no different. His wife, Eleanor, faded into the background of his dominion, her voice reduced to a polite echo. His 7 daughters, born in quick succession, grew beneath the weight of his expectations. Each girl learned early that silence was rewarded, that obedience kept his gaze from narrowing. At the long dining table, meals were rituals of restraint, forks lifted in unison, conversation nearly non-existent, the clinking of silverware against porcelain the only permitted music. Silas spoke sparingly at these meals, often directing his words toward no one in particular, as though addressing an invisible court. He would remark on the state of the mills, the unreliability of tenants, the softness of the world beyond his walls. His daughters listened, their hands folded neatly in their laps, their eyes cast downward. To meet his gaze too long was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was something none of them wished to endure. But it was in the library where Silas revealed the full breadth of his dominion. The room was his sanctum, lined with leather-bound tomes and maps of land he either owned or intended to. He would sit for hours at the great oak desk, scratching notes into his ledger, pausing only to sip the brandy that glowed amber in the lamplight. Servants were forbidden from entering unless summoned, and his daughters dared not cross the threshold. They said that when the door was closed, the scratching of his pen could still be heard through the walls, a ceaseless carving of judgment into paper. Though he rarely displayed affection, Silas considered himself a just man. He provided for his family, clothed them in silks, and kept their bellies full. Yet beneath his provision was an unspoken contract, a binding oath of loyalty and silence. He demanded not love but reverence. To him, obedience was a form of devotion, and devotion was the only currency worth anything in the house on the hill. The town spoke of him with equal parts awe and dread. They called him a patriarch, a master, sometimes even a tyrant, though never to his face. For Silas, Fairchild was a man whose shadow stretched farther than his body, and those who lived within its reach knew that once it fell upon them, there was no stepping out. The Fairchild Daughters moved through the house as though they were part of its design, as silent and spectral as the drapes that hung heavy over the tall windows. They had been raised in stillness, sculpted by it, bound to it. Words were rationed in the Fairchild household, spoken only when necessary, and always with a precision that bordered on ritual. To waste a syllable was to invite their father's gaze, and his gaze was more punishing than any lash of the whip. At dawn, they descended the staircase in order of age, their white hands grazing the rail polished smooth by generations of Fairchild palms. Each girl's face carried the same pallor, the same solemn mouth, the same absence of joy. Their dresses, though fine, were muted shades of gray and cream, chosen not to flatter but to erase. They ate breakfast together in a silence so deep that the scrape of a spoon against china felt like a violation. Their father's presence lingered even when he was not at the table, as though the walls themselves enforced his rules. Eliza, the eldest, bore the most responsibility. She carried herself with the stiff grace of someone who had learned to endure rather than to hope. Margaret, sharp-eyed and restless, often clenched her jaw as if swallowing back words that burned her tongue. Clara, the third, moved with a softness that seemed to dissolve her into the air, her fingers forever twitching, as though remembering the piano keys she was rarely allowed to touch. Isabel spoke the least, her lips pressed shut even in sleep, her wide eyes betraying the secrets she dared not voice. Ruth carried the look of a runner shackled at the ankles, her glance forever darting toward the windows. Catherine lived most in her head, scribbling half-sentences into journals that vanished as soon as they were found. And Anne, the youngest, clung to the hems of her sister's gowns, mimicking their silences before she had even learned her letters. The rules of the house were carved into them as surely as scripture. Do not speak at the table unless addressed. Do not question. Do not laugh. Do not sing. Keep your hands folded. Keep your eyes lowered. Keep your heart locked away, where it cannot betray you. These laws were enforced not through violence alone, but through the suffocating weight of expectation, through the daily reminder that they were daughters of Silas Fairchild, and to bear that name was both privilege and prison. Servants in the house learned quickly that the girls were not companions but shadows. They moved in pairs or trios, seldom alone, yet even together they spoke in whispers that barely carried beyond their lips. To outsiders, they seemed almost interchangeable, pale figures gliding through long corridors, their hair braided neatly, their steps soundless on the carpets. Yet to one another, they carried secret glances, coded silences. Small rebellions hidden in the flick of an eye or the twitch of a smile quickly smothered. The house itself seemed to conspire in their silence. The doors closed heavily, swallowing sound. The ceilings rose so high that voices seemed to vanish before reaching them. Even the clocks ticked softly, their hands moving like conspirators across faces of tarnished brass. It was a household where noise was not merely discouraged but devoured, and so the daughters became fluent in quiet. They learned to communicate in the language of stillness, the way a hand lingered too long on a banister, the way a shoulder brushed another in passing, the way a tear left unwiped told more truth than a scream could. Within their silence lay 1,000 stories, 1,000 unsaid things, all of them locked away beneath the iron will of the patriarch who demanded it so. Though the Fairchild house was filled with 7 young women, it felt curiously empty, as if the very essence of them had been drawn out and sealed beneath the floorboards. They lived like echoes, each one fading more quickly than the last, until the only sound left in the household was the oppressive silence they had inherited and the whispering ghosts it kept alive. Eliza Fairchild had always been the model of her father's design. As the eldest daughter, she carried the mantle of expectation with the kind of precision that seemed almost inhuman. Her posture was flawless, her tone even, her steps measured. In the eyes of Silas Fairchild, she was the proof that his household could be ordered, perfected, and preserved. But beneath the surface of obedience, Eliza's soul was not without its tremors. Servants noticed the way her fingers lingered on the windowsill when she thought herself unwatched, her gaze fixed on the road leading away from the estate. They noticed how her sighs grew heavier each winter, as though she were slowly suffocating in the stillness her father demanded. When she turned 17, Eliza's health began to falter, or so the official account went. The doctor, a gaunt man who owed his practice to Silas's patronage, declared it to be consumption. He scribbled the word quickly on his ledger, avoiding the girl's eyes as she lay pale in her bed, her breaths shallow, her lips cracked. To the household, it was an explanation both tidy and tragic, the kind of illness that came for many young women and claimed them without scandal. Yet whispers told a different story. The maids had heard the arguments, Eliza's voice, firm yet breaking, and Silas's low rumble, measured but merciless. What had passed between them no one knew, but it left the girl shaken, her eyes swollen from unshed tears. Some said she had defied him, dared to question his rules, perhaps even asked for the impossible, freedom. Others claimed she had been caught writing letters to someone beyond the hollow, letters that never reached their destination. Whatever the truth, the change in her was swift. She no longer drifted to the windows. She no longer touched the banister as she descended the stairs. She withdrew, as though the very act of living had been called into question. Her decline was not the kind that consumption usually brings. There was no fever, no cough that rattled the ribs, no blood staining her handkerchief. Instead, there was a slow dimming, a retreat inward. Her meals went untouched. Her body grew thinner, her frame fragile as glass. Yet her eyes, once bright with the weight of unspoken thoughts, remained startlingly clear, as though she were observing the world from a distance, already partway across some unseen threshold. The night she died, the house was hushed, even beyond its usual silence. The servants recalled hearing no movement, no footsteps, no stirring from her chamber. It was as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. When dawn came, Eliza was gone, her body arranged neatly in the bed, hands folded across her chest as though she had been prepared for burial long before her final breath. Silas announced her death with neither grief nor softness. He ordered the doctor's explanation copied into the family record, and the word consumption was carved onto a slip of paper that was tucked away in his ledger. But there was no headstone, no epitaph, no marker of any kind. The eldest daughter of Fairchild was placed into the ground behind the estate, her grave left unmarked like a secret too dangerous to admit. Among the staff, the whispers never ceased. Some swore they saw bruises along her arms when they laid her out, faint but undeniable. Others claimed her lips bore the blue tint of something darker than illness. And a few insisted that on certain nights, when the mist crept low across the hollow, a figure could be seen near the rear of the property, a young woman standing where the unmarked earth rose slightly, her pale dress blending with the fog, her eyes fixed forever on the road beyond the gates. Eliza had been the obedient heir, the daughter who bore the family's weight most dutifully. Yet her obedience had not saved her. Instead, it had buried her, as it would bury the rest. Her story was the first, but it set the tone for all that followed. In the house on the hill, loyalty was never rewarded with freedom. It was rewarded with silence, with earth, and with the promise that no one beyond the estate would ever know the truth. If Eliza had been obedience made flesh, Margaret was its opposite. Where her elder sister carried silence like a crown, Margaret wore defiance like armor. Sharp-tongued and quick of wit, she had a way of filling even the stillest room with tension, a crackle in the air that neither her father nor her sisters could ignore. Servants whispered that she was the only daughter who dared to meet Silas Fairchild's gaze without lowering her eyes, and though it earned her punishments both subtle and severe, it also gave her an aura of dangerous vitality. She was 17 the night she vanished, the same age her sister had been when death claimed her. A storm had gathered over Blackwood Hollow that evening, the kind that shook shutters and rattled glass. The family dined together as thunder rolled across the valley, their candles flickering against the draught. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on her father with a defiance that dared him to speak. He did not. When the meal ended, she rose without asking permission, her skirts brushing against the stone floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. No one saw her leave. At least, no one confessed to it. But those awake in the house swore they heard it. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive, muffled by rain but unmistakable. A single sound, brief yet heavy with finality, before the storm swallowed it whole. By morning, Margaret was gone. Silas offered no explanation, no search, no word to the town. He declared only that his second daughter had gone to visit relatives, though none could say which. Her sisters knew better. Her place at the table remained empty, and her name was struck from her father's speech as though she had never existed. Yet on nights when storms returned to the hollow, servants whispered of hoofbeats echoing faintly through the valley, of a carriage that rolled where no carriage should. Some claimed to have glimpsed a pale face pressed to the window, dark eyes gleaming with both terror and defiance. Whether Margaret fled, was taken, or was buried in secret like her sister, No one could say. But the storm never ceased to carry her memory, and the gravel drive seemed to remember the weight of wheels long gone. Clara Fairchild had been the only one among the daughters who could soften the house's iron edges. Music clung to her the way silence clung to her sisters. She had inherited her mother's delicate hands, long fingers that moved over the keys of the grand piano with a grace that seemed to summon air itself into harmony. When Clara played, the house seemed less a prison and more a cathedral. Even the servants, forbidden from lingering in doorways, found excuses to pass through the parlor when she sat at the bench. The notes she coaxed from ivory and wood were not just sounds, they were a fleeting reprieve, a reminder that something beautiful could exist even under the shadow of Silas Fairchild. Silas tolerated her gift, but only so far as it served him. He would summon Clara to play when guests were present, her music a display of refinement, a mark of culture for a man who prized his reputation above all. Yet in private, he seldom allowed her the indulgence. To his mind, music softened the will, and softness was weakness. Still, Clara returned to the piano whenever she could, often in the hush of late evenings, when the house was dark and her sisters slept. It was then that her true music emerged, not the rigid hymns or formal pieces her father demanded, but melodies she invented, fragile and sorrowful, spilling secrets into the air. It was during one such midnight performance that the house seemed to conspire against her. The notes faltered, echoing strangely, as if the strings groaned in pain. A servant passing the hall later recalled hearing a discordant crash, a single chord struck with violent force, followed by silence so heavy it pressed against the skin. When morning came, Clara was found slumped against the piano, her head bowed, her fingers still curled as though clutching at invisible keys. Her face was pale, her lips parted as if she had been in the midst of a final breath that never finished. The doctor again was summoned, and again a tidy explanation was given. Her heart had simply failed. But those who saw the body whispered of her hands, bruised at the knuckles, red along the fingertips, as though she had played until the flesh itself gave way. The keys bore faint smears where skin had split, tiny stains of crimson swallowed by the black and white. Silas did not permit mourning. The piano was closed and locked, its lid never to be raised again. Clara's name was erased from the household as thoroughly as if she had never lived. Her portrait was removed from the hall, her belongings dispersed without ceremony. When the family record was updated, a single line of ink struck her name clean through, as though sound itself had been forbidden from remembering her. Yet the house remembered. On windless nights, when the corridors grew too still, faint music sometimes drifted from the locked parlor, a hesitant chord, a wandering melody that carried both sorrow and defiance. Servants who heard it swore that the piano keys moved on their own, that the notes rose not from wood and string but from the memory of the girl who had once dared to fill the Fairchild house with life. Clara was gone, yet her music lingered, haunting the silence her father demanded, refusing to be struck from the world as easily as from his ledger. The servants of the Fairchild estate were never meant to speak, not of what they saw, nor of what they heard. Their wages depended on silence, and Silas Fairchild had a way of making even the thought of disobedience dangerous. Yet, in the years after the daughters began to disappear one by one, scraps of testimony surfaced like fragments of a broken mirror. Each piece was partial, incomplete, but when pieced together they revealed a household not merely haunted by grief, but by something far darker. One maid, whose trembling words were passed down through rumor, described waking in the night to the sound of screams. Not loud, open cries, but muffled, the kind that claw at walls and bite into pillows. She swore she could hear them coming from the upper floor, the wing where the daughters' chambers lay. When she pressed her ear to the door, she claimed the walls themselves seemed to throb with the sound, and though she longed to intervene, her feet would not move. By morning the halls were quiet, and the daughters' faces revealed nothing but pale exhaustion. A groundskeeper spoke of arguments that rattled the library doors. He would hear Silas's voice, steady and deliberate, never raised but sharp as the strike of a blade. Then came the softer tones of the daughters pleading, reasoning, their words cut short by the thud of something heavy or the sudden dreadful silence that followed. He told no one at the time, for to repeat what he had heard would have been to sign his own dismissal, or worse. Most unsettling of all were the reports of the locked rooms. Several servants, ordered to clean or deliver, recalled finding certain doors barred from within. Through the cracks, strange smells seeped out, a tang of iron, sharp and metallic, mingled with the coarse bite of salt. These were not the scents of illness, nor of medicine, but of rituals no one dared name. Once, a young scullery maid confessed to seeing a faint red stain along the threshold of a locked chamber. When she asked about it, the head housekeeper struck her across the face and told her never to speak of it again. Servants came and went in the Fairchild house with unnerving regularity. Some lasted only a week before vanishing without word, their positions quietly replaced by others desperate enough to endure. Those who stayed longer carried their silence like chains, their eyes hollowed by things they could not tell. The accounts that survived were pieced together in whispers, told over mugs of ale in the tavern at the edge of the hollow, where Silas's shadow did not stretch so far. And though each servant feared retribution, they could not resist the telling, for what they had seen and heard was not easily forgotten. The Fairchild house was not just a place of wealth and discipline, but of cries swallowed by stone, of secrets sealed in salt and iron. And those who worked within its walls knew, perhaps better than the family itself, that something monstrous stirred beneath the silence. Isabel Fairchild had always been the most delicate of the sisters, her frame slight, her voice soft as though the very act of speaking might shatter her. While the others carried their father's features in sharper lines, stern mouths, rigid postures, Isabel seemed a wisp of a girl, her pale hair always escaping its pins, her hands fluttering like restless birds. Servants often said she was the gentlest of the Fairchild daughters, but also the one least suited to the harsh silences of the house. It began with whispers. Isabel claimed she heard them first at night, threading through the cracks in her chamber walls like draughts of cold air. She told her sisters that the house spoke to her, that when she pressed her ear against the stone she could hear voices shifting just beyond reach, murmuring names she half recognized. At first the others dismissed it as fancies, the sort of imaginings their father forbade them to indulge. But Isabel was insistent. The voices were not dreams. They grew louder with each passing evening. By the third night, she would not sleep. Servants found her sitting upright on her bed, wide-eyed and pale, whispering back to the walls as though engaged in a private conversation. Her words made little sense, a mixture of prayer and plea, but her conviction chilled those who overheard. One maid confessed she dared not linger in Isabel's room, for the air seemed to press heavy on her chest, carrying with it a faint hum like a song only Isabel could hear. The family doctor was summoned after Isabel collapsed during breakfast, her spoon slipping from her hand into the untouched porridge before her. He examined her with clinical detachment, finding no fever, no injury, only the erratic tremor of her pulse. He called it exhaustion of the nerves, an ailment of weak constitution, and prescribed rest. When Isabel insisted that the voices had begun to follow her into daylight, that she heard them whispering from beneath the floorboards of the dining hall, the doctor labeled her condition delirium. His report satisfied Silas, who dismissed further concern. Within the week, Isabel was dead. She had been found in her chamber at dawn, the shutters sealed, the fire burned out, her lips parted as though she had been mid-sentence. There was no mark upon her, no sign of violence. The doctor signed the certificate swiftly. Death due to fevered delirium. Yet the servants whispered otherwise. They claimed her expression was not one of pain but of listening, her head tilted slightly toward the wall, as if straining to catch the last echo of the voices that had called her all along. Her burial, like those of her sisters before her, was carried out in silence. No marker was placed upon the grave, no words spoken in remembrance. The Fairchild name demanded discretion, and Isabel's fragile existence was folded neatly into the house's long ledger of shadows. Yet those who had heard her in her final days could not shake the thought that perhaps Isabel had not been sick at all. Perhaps she had simply heard too much, and the voices in the walls had claimed her as their own. The Fairchild dining hall was a cavernous chamber built for spectacle, its ceilings carved with cherubs that mocked the silence below. On the night of the hollow banquet, the long oak table was set as though for a feast of kings. Silver polished to blinding brilliance, crystal goblets catching the dim light of the chandeliers, and platters of roasted meats sending heavy scents into the air. Yet the grandeur could not disguise the hollowness that seeped into every corner. For each daughter gone, an empty chair remained, drawn back slightly as though still awaiting its occupant. Silas Fairchild presided at the head of the table, his presence a weight none of his daughters dared to meet with their eyes. His posture was rigid, his gaze unyielding, and every movement the lifting of his fork, the measured sip of his wine was deliberate, commanding. At his right sat the 4 remaining daughters, their faces pale, their bodies stiff as porcelain figures. Eliza's place was left untouched, Margaret's chair unfilled, Clara's seat gleaming in its absence, and Isabel's still warm in memory. Though only days had passed since her burial, the silence was unbearable. No one dared to speak, for words in the Fairchild home were as dangerous as fire in dry wood. Instead, the only sounds were the clink of cutlery against porcelain and the faint crackle of the hearth. The daughters ate mechanically, each bite a performance rather than nourishment. Their eyes occasionally flickered to the empty spaces beside them, as if half expecting their lost sisters to return, drawn back by the ritual of supper. But the chairs remained vacant, shadows settling over them like shrouds. Servants moved in silence along the edges of the room, careful never to disrupt the atmosphere. They carried dishes steaming with rich gravies and fruits glistening with syrup, but not one of them looked directly at the table. It was said later that the air in the hall that night felt thicker than usual, heavy with something unspoken, as though the missing daughters lingered just beyond the veil, waiting to be acknowledged but never named. At one point, a goblet spilled near Clara's vacant seat, though Clara was no longer there to touch it. The wine seeped across the linen, dark and spreading, like blood released from an invisible wound. The servants hurried to clear it, but the daughters exchanged glances, each one thinking the same thought, that their father had not removed the chairs as a gesture of mourning, but as a warning. By the end of the meal, the food remained largely untouched, congealing on plates no one had the stomach to finish. Still, Silas rose with the dignity of a sovereign, declaring the meal complete without a word of loss or remembrance. His eyes swept the table, pausing on the empty chairs as if to remind his daughters of their duty. They were to endure, obedient and silent, or else join their sisters in absence. The daughters rose in unison, their chairs scraping softly against the stone floor, a hollow chorus echoing beneath the chandeliers. As they filed out, the table remained behind them, glittering with silver and shadow, a grotesque altar to those who no longer had a place in the world of the living. And though the hall was emptied, the impression lingered that the Fairchild family had not truly dined alone. Ruth Fairchild had always harbored a spark that no silence could quench. Where her sisters bowed their heads, she lifted hers, if only in fleeting moments when her father's back was turned. She was the 5th daughter, caught between the weight of the sisters lost and the fear that pressed down on those who remained. Perhaps it was this position, neither first nor last, that fed her resolve. She had seen too much to believe escape was impossible, and yet she had not yet been broken enough to accept the house as her tomb. It was in the deep hours of a moonless night that Ruth made her attempt. A servant awoke to the faint creak of a door and the soft patter of bare feet along the hall. Others swore they heard nothing at all, only the howl of wind through the hollow. But in town, a handful of villagers later claimed they saw her, a girl in a white nightgown, hair streaming wild behind her, darting between the black pines at the edge of the estate. She moved like a wraith, pale and frantic, her figure illuminated by flashes of lanterns and the fickle light of the stars. Some believed she had reached the road. A miller, trudging home late, insisted he glimpsed her sprinting across the bend, her gown torn, her breath visible in the cold air. He did not follow, for something in the way she ran unnerved him, a desperation so absolute that it seemed not merely escape from a house, but from something unseen that clung to her heels. Yet by dawn, Ruth was returned. No one saw who carried her back, nor how she was caught. Her nightgown was muddied and torn, her feet bloodied from stones and roots. But she was whole in body. Whole, yet not the same. She walked into the house without protest, her face blank, her eyes emptied of the light that once defied her father's gaze. From that morning onward, Ruth spoke no word. Not in whispers to her sisters, not in confessions to the servants, not even in prayers to the heavens. Silas declared that his daughter had suffered a fit of hysteria, that her silence was an affliction of the mind, nothing more. But those who had seen her running through the trees knew better. They said she had tasted freedom and been dragged back from it, bound forever after by whatever force governed the Fairchild house. Some wondered if her silence was a vow, or a punishment, or the last shred of will she could claim for herself. The white nightgown was never seen again. Ruth took to wearing only dark garments, as though to erase the memory of her flight. But on certain nights, when the wind swept through the hollow, villagers swore they could still glimpse her figure darting through the trees, a pale phantom in flight, running endlessly toward a dawn that never came. Catherine Fairchild was different from her sisters in one crucial way, she wrote. While the others carried their fears silently, Catherine pressed hers into paper, scratching lines of ink beneath candlelight when the house was still. Her journals, discovered years later hidden within a false drawer of her dressing table, remain among the few surviving relics of the Fairchild Daughters. Through them, her voice reaches across the decades, trembling yet resolute, chronicling a descent into terror too precise to dismiss as girlish fancy. She described the house not as a structure of stone and wood, but as a living thing. In her entries, the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling drafts that chilled her skin even when the hearth burned high. She wrote of doors that stood where none had been before, of corridors that lengthened in the night, stretching farther than memory allowed. The house rearranges itself, she noted, like a beast turning in its sleep. At first, she attributed these impressions to her imagination. But as days passed, she could not ignore the feeling that the Fairchild mansion watched her, that its windows were not glass but eyes, unblinking and merciless, reflecting her every move. The journals darken when Catherine turns her attention to her father's library. She dreaded the room above all others. "The books whisper," she wrote, "though no one is near enough to speak. When father locks the door, I hear them still. They scrape against one another like teeth." On one occasion, she confessed to standing before the library's locked entrance, convinced that something pressed against it from the inside, straining to be let out. Her words swell with panic as she wonders what her father guards so carefully among his volumes. "He lingers there too long," she wrote. "When he emerges, his eyes shine as though he has fed on something I cannot name." In her final week of entries, Catherine's writing grows hurried, her script erratic, ink blotting the margins. She writes of her sisters' absences, of their names no longer spoken, and of her certainty that the house itself is swallowing them. "The walls have mouths," she wrote. "They devour us one by one." In fact, the last page holds a single, unfinished line, cut off as though the pen had been ripped from her hand. It reads, "He is at the door now, and I can hear." No more follows. The ink trails into a smear, the page torn slightly at the edge, suggesting a struggle or interruption. Catherine was never seen again after that night. Her room remained undisturbed, save for the journals hidden in their secret drawer, waiting to be found. For the servants who later whispered of her writings, the meaning was clear. Catherine had not merely feared the house, she had uncovered its truth. And like her sisters before her, she was silenced before she could speak it aloud. Anne Fairchild was the youngest, the final thread in the unraveling tapestry of the family. By the time her turn came, she had grown up not in the shadow of her elder sisters, but in the voids they left behind. Their names were struck from conversation, their portraits removed from the walls, and yet their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Anne walked through a house filled with silence that was heavy, deliberate, and suffocating. She knew the rules by heart, not because her father had spoken them often, but because she had seen what became of those who faltered. Unlike her sisters, Anne did not rebel. She did not run, nor sing, nor press words into journals. Instead, she watched. The servants whispered that she was a ghost even before her death, her step light, her voice softer than the rustle of curtains, her presence barely felt. Some believed she had already resigned herself to the fate that had claimed the six before her, as if she had been born only to complete their grim procession. The end came swiftly, though no one could later describe exactly how. One morning, Anne was gone. Her bed was left neatly made, her slippers aligned at its foot. No sign of struggle, no trace of illness. The house, as always, offered no explanation. By dusk, word spread through the hollow that Anne had been buried, lowered into the earth with the same ruthless efficiency that had accompanied her sister's fates. No funeral was held. No priest was summoned. The place of her grave was left unmarked, indistinguishable from the surrounding soil, as though the world itself had conspired to erase her existence. Among the locals, her disappearance became the seal upon the curse of the Fairchilds. 6 daughters lost had been a tragedy. 7 buried in silence became something darker. Something that could not be explained by consumption, delirium, or fits of hysteria. With Anne's burial, the line of daughters ended, the house left without its pale occupants who had once drifted through its corridors like shades. The servants whispered that her death marked the completion of a circle that the house had claimed what it was owed. Some swore they heard weeping in the garden on the night of her burial, though none could find its source. Others claimed that, in the weeks that followed, the 7th chair at the dining table remained drawn back, as if waiting for her still. Anne became the final silence, the closing of a door that would never again be opened. With her gone, the Fairchild mansion seemed to grow darker, its windows like hollow eyes staring down upon Blackwood Hollow. The curse was sealed not by a storm or fire, but by absent 7 daughters gone, 7 graves left unmarked, their names swallowed into the earth as though they had never lived at all. Blackwood Hollow was a town of whispers. Its cobbled streets wound tightly together, its cottages crouched against the surrounding woods, and its people lived under a veil of discretion that seemed stitched into their very marrow. To live in Blackwood Hollow was to know when not to ask, when not to see, when not to speak, and nothing embodied this silence more than the shadow of the Fairchild name. The disappearances of the daughters were known to all, though never admitted aloud. Each burial was carried out at dawn or dusk, quiet processions of servants under Silas Fairchild's command, and yet somehow the townsfolk always knew. They would see the lanterns flickering along the road, hear the distant creak of wagon wheels carrying burdens no one dared describe. Still, when morning came, they greeted one another with practiced ignorance, nodding over market stalls and hearths as though nothing had changed. It was not that they were blind, it was that the Fairchilds had taught them fear. Silas controlled not only the estate but the livelihood of the hollow. His lands fed the town, his money lined its shops and kept its tavern alive. To question him was to risk ruin, to risk exile from the fragile web that bound the town together. And so, Blackwood Hollow trained itself to look away. Parents told their children that curiosity was dangerous, that asking about the Fairchilds was like opening a door you could never close again. Yet, in tavern corners and behind shuttered windows, the whispers grew. Some said Silas was cursed, that no man could lose 7 daughters without some unholy bargain at work. Others believed the house itself was alive, a parasite feeding on the fragile lives born within its walls. And a few, the bravest or perhaps the most foolish, claimed that they had seen the daughters even after their burials, figures in white wandering the tree line, or faces glimpsed in the upper windows long after the girls were gone. The silence of the town was not without cost. It became a silence that infected the air, a heaviness that even visitors could sense. Travelers spoke of the hollow as unfriendly, a place where eyes followed strangers too closely and where conversations ceased the moment one entered a room. The Fairchild mansion loomed at the edge of every thought, its cracked windows glinting from the hill, a constant reminder of what power demanded. In time, the disappearances were folded into the fabric of the hollow. The town carried on, markets bustling, children playing, bells tolling in the chapel. But beneath it all was a shared understanding. The Fairchild daughters had vanished, one by one, and no one would ever hold Silas accountable. Their silence was both survival and complicity, a pact of denial that allowed life to continue while the graves beneath unmarked soil multiplied. Blackwood Hollow learned to live with its secret, but it never escaped it. The hush of the townspeople became as much a curse as the shadow that lingered over the mansion on the hill. And in that silence, the memory of the daughters endured, buried not only in earth but in the mouths of those who refused to speak their names. The discovery of the ledger came long after the last Fairchild daughter had been buried, when the mansion had already begun to rot into itself. Found behind a false panel in the judge's study, a chamber reserved for Silas alone, it was a thick volume bound in dark leather, the edges of its pages curled with age and damp. It carried no title, only the stern impression of a man's hand pressed into every line of ink. Those who first opened it realized at once that it was no ordinary record of accounts, but something darker, a chronicle of obsession dressed in the rigid structure of law. Silas Fairchild had not been merely a patriarch and landowner. He had been a judge in Blackwood Hollow, a man whose rulings could determine fates with a single stroke of his pen. The ledger bore this same precision. Each entry was dated, written in a careful hand, neat as scripture. But instead of rulings for townsfolk, the subject was his own household, his daughters, his blood. The early entries spoke of transgressions so slight they bordered on the absurd. Eliza failing to meet his gaze at supper, Margaret speaking out of turn, Clara lingering too long at the piano. Each note carried a tone of disdain, describing these acts not as ordinary missteps but as moral failings. Weakness, he wrote, again and again. Pride, vanity, temptation. The language of the court had been turned inward, his household transformed into a tribunal where he alone passed judgment. As the ledger continued, the entries grew harsher, more detailed. Isabel's talk of voices in the walls was catalogued not as illness but as blasphemy. Ruth's attempt at flight became betrayal. Catherine's journals, which she must have hidden with care, were denounced as false witness. Each daughter was measured not as a child but as a defendant, and their punishments were recorded with the same cold detachment. Silas referred to their deaths not as tragedies but as final repentance, as though their very lives had been trials culminating in inevitable verdicts. What unsettled those who read the ledger most were the gaps, the abrupt endings of certain entries, followed by silence until the next daughter's name appeared. Beside some passages were faint smears of ink, as if the pen had pressed too hard, betraying the strain beneath his otherwise flawless script. The final pages carried only fragments. Phrases like, "seventh sin sealed," and "the house bears witness." No names were written after Anne's, no judgments passed. The ledger ended not with resolution but with an unfinished scrawl, as though Silas himself had been interrupted before he could record the final verdict. The book was hidden again, locked away by those too fearful to let it circulate. But the memory of it spread nonetheless, whispered in the hollow as proof of what many had long suspected, that the Fairchild daughters had not merely died or disappeared, but had been condemned by the very hand that should have protected them. And the ledger, with its precise cruelty, revealed not only a father's madness, but the meticulous calculation behind it, a record of sins that belonged less to the daughters and more to the judge who had written them. The nursery of the Fairchild mansion was a place preserved in eerie stillness, a chamber that had not heard laughter for decades yet looked as though it still expected children to return at any moment. The door creaked when opened, revealing rows of neatly arranged toys, dolls in porcelain finery, blocks stacked into towers, a wooden train poised forever on the edge of its track. Dust coated every surface, softening the bright colors into muted shades, but the order of the room remained unnatural, almost deliberate, as if unseen hands had maintained it long after its purpose had ended. Most disturbing of all was the rocking horse. Carved from pale wood, its painted eyes wide and glassy, it stood in the center of the room like a sentinel. Those who entered swore that it swayed, ever so slightly, even when the air was still. The windows in the nursery were sealed, the curtains stiff with age, yet the horse would tip forward and back with the faintest groan of its joints, as though responding to a rider invisible to the living eye. The nursery was forbidden ground in Silas's time. Servants claimed the judge had locked it after his youngest daughters had outgrown it, declaring the room closed and not to be entered again. Yet the air inside was thick with something more than disuse. It carried the faintest scent of lavender and dust, mingled with a sweetness gone sour, like milk left too long. The dolls, lined neatly on shelves, seemed to watch those who trespassed, their painted smiles cracking with age into grimaces. Some said that the nursery echoed with sounds at night. Servants hurrying past the door whispered of faint giggles, of lullabies hummed low, of the rhythmic creak of wood as the rocking horse moved, though no hand touched it. One groundskeeper swore he had heard the sound of marbles scattering across the floor, though when he dared to open the door, the toys were untouched, the marbles neatly placed in their box. The nursery's preservation felt intentional, as though it had been left as an offering to memory or a trap. Perhaps Silas kept it untouched to remind his daughters of their earliest years, when innocence could still be controlled. Perhaps he feared what might be unleashed if the room were disturbed. Or perhaps it was not his hand that preserved it at all, but the restless presence of those who had once played there. By the time the house was abandoned, the nursery had become a chamber of superstition. No villager dared enter it, and those who did claimed to feel the air press against them like a hand on the chest, urging them to leave. Still, the toys waited, their patience eternal, their silence louder than any scream. And in the center, the rocking horse swayed on, carrying its invisible burden, never stopping, as if the children of the Fairchild line had never truly left it behind. The graves of the Fairchild daughters lay hidden far from the polished stones of Blackwood Hollow's churchyard. No crosses rose above them, no carved names marked their passing. They were buried in silence, consigned to the earth as though secrecy could erase memory. For years the ground lay undisturbed, an expanse of grass and bramble at the edge of the woods where few dared to walk. But secrecy has a way of unraveling, and one evening, a stranger lost on the Hollow's winding roads stumbled into the place where the Fairchild dead were meant to rest unseen. The man was not of the town. Some said he was a traveling peddler, others that he was merely a wanderer with no name worth remembering. What is known is that he entered the wood at dusk and came upon a clearing unlike the others. The soil was uneven, as though dug and hastily filled. There were 7 rises in the earth, each one narrow and long, their spacing too precise to be mistaken for anything but graves. No stones, no flowers, only the muted hush of the forest pressing close around them. Yet what caught the man's attention was not the arrangement of the mounds but the way the earth seemed unsettled. Several patches bore the marks of recent disturbance. The soil cracked as if something below had shifted. In places, the grass refused to grow, leaving raw scars in the ground. The man swore later that he heard movement beneath his feet, a faint shifting, the brittle crack of roots breaking, as though the buried were restless. When word reached the town of his discovery, the villagers pretended indifference. But behind closed doors, the whispers grew. Some claimed the daughters were not at rest, that their unmarked graves were prisons rather than sanctuaries. Others wondered if the ground itself rejected them, unable to contain lives ended with such violence and secrecy. The stranger, pale with terror, told one final tale before vanishing from the hollow altogether. He said that as he turned to flee the clearing, he glimpsed a pale hand breaking through the earth of one mound, delicate, feminine. Fingers clawing at the air before sinking once more into the soil. Whether this was truth or delirium, none could say. But the hollow carried the story like a fever, and even those who scoffed refused to tread near that part of the woods again. The unmarked graves remained, slowly sinking into the earth, swallowed by moss and vine. Yet no storm washed them away. No root claimed them fully. They endured, silent but uneasy, as if waiting. Those who dared to listen swore the clearing never fell truly quiet, that a faint hum rose from the soil at night, not quite a voice, not quite the wind, only the sound of the forgotten refusing to be forgotten. Silas Fairchild's death came not with thunder but with a whisper. There were no doctors at his bedside, no clergy summoned to anoint him, no daughters left to close his eyes. He died alone in the master chamber, curtains drawn tight, the fire long since turned to ash. When the servants found him, his body was stiff, his face contorted not in peace but in something between defiance and dread, as if even in death he had refused to yield. The news spread quickly through Blackwood Hollow, but it was met not with mourning, only a cautious relief. For years, the town had lived in his shadow, bound to his wealth, cowed by his authority, fearful of the curse whispered around his family name. With his passing, many thought the grip would finally loosen. But when his will was read, it became clear that Silas had left nothing behind but emptiness. The estate was not bequeathed to kin, for none remained. The family fortune, meticulously guarded for generations, had been drained, squandered on ventures no one could trace, or locked in accounts that vanished with him. The house itself, the great Fairchild mansion on the hill, stood ownerless, abandoned to time. At first, the servants lingered, hoping for wages that never came. They drifted away one by one, until only dust remained to tend the halls. Without hands to maintain it, the house began to unravel. Ivy crawled higher over its stone face, cracking mortar, forcing open the seams. Rain seeped through the roof, staining ceilings and warping wood. The great windows, once polished to reflect the valley, dulled to gray, their panes fractured like broken eyes. Inside, decay crept through every corridor. The carpets rotted, the chandeliers tarnished, and the dining hall once set with silver and silence grew damp with mold. The nursery toys sagged in their places, fabric eaten by moths, their painted smiles fading to smears. The piano, Clara's piano, sank beneath a layer of dust so thick the keys no longer gleamed, though some swore they still sounded faint notes when no one stood near. The fortune that had kept Blackwood Hollow tethered to the Fairchilds withered as quickly as the house. Tenants abandoned their farms when rents went unpaid, merchants muttered of debts never settled. The name once spoken with both reverence and dread became a curse in itself, a story whispered only to warn children of the dangers of pride and cruelty. The house, stripped of purpose, stood as Silas's true inheritance, a monument to ruin. It decayed not quietly, but theatrically, its sagging roof and leaning chimneys visible from every corner of the hollow. The people avoided it, crossing themselves when its shadow fell across their path. Yet they could not look away entirely, for the mansion loomed above them still, a hollow crown on a hill, its silence heavier than any voice. In the end, Silas left nothing of value behind: no heirs, no wealth, no legacy, but a rotting estate and 7 unmarked graves hidden beneath the soil. The curse, it seemed, had not ended with his death. It had only been passed on to the house itself, which crumbled slowly under the weight of its own secrets. The return of a Fairchild was something Blackwood Hollow had long believed impossible. The family had ended with Silas, so the stories said, its bloodline extinguished along with its fortune. Yet on a gray autumn morning, when fog curled low around the valley, a stranger arrived at the edge of town carrying the unmistakable weight of the name. His clothes were plain, his manner quiet, but the resemblance was there in the hard line of the jaw, the cold steel of the eyes. His name was Nathaniel Fairchild, great-grandson of Silas's estranged brother, a branch of the family tree believed long severed. He did not announce himself loudly. He needed no fanfare. Whispers spread quickly enough through the town. A Fairchild had come back to the hollow, and with him, perhaps, the curse. Some prayed he would leave as quickly as he had appeared. Others, bolder in their curiosity, watched him with furtive glances, wondering why anyone would dare set foot in that house on the hill. Nathaniel's purpose was clear. He had inherited nothing but stories, fragments of rumors passed down like a sickness, tales of 7 daughters who vanished, graves with no names, and a patriarch whose cruelty was said to linger even beyond death. He had grown up with the shadows of this legacy, haunting his sleep, and as he grew older, the unanswered questions hardened into obsession. He came not for wealth, for there was none to be found, but for truth. The mansion greeted him like a corpse propped upright, its windows hollow, its walls blackened by rot and rain. The iron gates, rusted to a red-brown, shrieked as he pushed them open. Vines wrapped the stone pillars, and crows lifted from the roof in a dark flurry at his approach. The great door yielded reluctantly, and when he crossed the threshold, the air struck him with a chill that carried more memory than dust. Inside, the silence was not empty. It pressed against him, alive with the weight of years. The smell of damp wood and mildew clung to every surface, but beneath it, faint as breath, lingered something metallic iron, salt, the tang of old blood. Nathaniel walked the corridors with deliberate steps, noting how the portraits stared from the walls, their faces eaten by mildew, yet their eyes curiously intact, watching him as though they recognized their kin. He explored the rooms methodically. The dining hall, with its long table bowed by time, still bore the impressions of absent chairs. The nursery lay frozen in an eerie tableau, toys arranged in a stillness too deliberate to be chance. He paused longest in the study, where the remnants of Silas's library sat in disarray, shelves warped, books swollen with damp. Yet one volume lay open on the desk, its ink faded but legible, a ledger of names and dates, margins marked with the same words his family had whispered: sins, weaknesses, repentance. That night, Nathaniel did not sleep. He sat in the crumbling library, the sound of the wind weaving through cracks in the stone, and he listened. Some part of him believed he could hear the house breathing, shifting around him, alive with restless memory. And when, near midnight, he thought he heard faint footsteps in the corridor above, he did not run. He only whispered to the dark, "I have come for the truth. Show me." The first spade struck earth just beyond the tree line, where the ground bore its 7 long humps. Nathaniel had hired no company, no workmen from the hollow, for not a soul would come near the place. Instead, he labored with his own hands, sweat mingling with the damp loam as he dug into the soil the villagers had long feared. Each shovelful seemed heavier than the last, as though the ground resisted disturbance, as though it knew what lay beneath should not be unearthed. By the third day, his persistence was rewarded. His spade struck wood splintered, swollen, and blackened with rot. He cleared the soil with cautious hands, brushing aside roots that had grown thick and twisted, binding the coffin as though nature itself sought to chain it down. When at last he pried open the lid, the stench that rose was not of simple decay. It carried with it something acrid, like burnt herbs and iron, a smell that felt deliberate. The skeleton within was fragile, the bones delicate, unmistakably feminine. Yet their arrangement was unnatural. The hands had been crossed not over the chest but folded tightly across the face, as if silencing a scream. Strange markings had been carved into the wood of the coffin's interior circles, intersected by jagged lines, symbols neither wholly religious nor wholly arcane, but something between the two. The etchings seemed to pulse in the dim light, as though the years had not dulled their intent. Nathaniel unearthed more graves, each revealing its own grotesque detail. One daughter's bones were laid in a spiral, the ribcage twisted unnaturally as though forced into shape. Another's coffin bore stains of wax and soot, with candle stubs fused to the corners, remnants of rituals long extinguished. In another he found small talismans, iron nails, bird skulls, fragments of glass buried among the bones as though placed with purpose. What disturbed him most was the absence of peace in any of them. None of the daughters had been buried with dignity. None left to rest in silence. Each coffin bore signs of deliberate arrangement, of a hand guiding their deaths into something more than tragedy, into something ritualistic. The ledger's words, sins, weaknesses, repentance, echoed through his mind as he studied the symbols carved into the coffins. Were these meant as punishments? Or were they protections, binding the restless spirits from escaping the soil? As the final coffin cracked open, Nathaniel felt the air shift. The clearing grew unnaturally still, the wind dropping, the forest pausing as though to listen. The bones lay pale against the dark earth, but the markings within this coffin were sharper, less eroded, as though carved yesterday. He traced them with his hand, the wood splintering beneath his fingers, and felt a sting, a shallow cut that bled immediately. The blood soaked into the carving, and for the briefest moment, Nathaniel swore the earth beneath him moved. Not a tremor, not the settling of soil, but a pulse. A slow, deliberate throb, as though the graves themselves were waking to his touch. The revelation came not with sudden clarity but with the slow, dreadful weight of inevitability. Nathaniel sat among the opened coffins, his lantern casting thin light across bones and symbols that seemed to writhe beneath the flame. The ledger he had taken from the library lay open on the ground beside him, its pages scrawled with words that now made terrible sense. Silas had not been content to silence his daughters in death. He had bound them, written their bodies into a scripture of control. The graves were not resting places. They were prisons. The carvings inside the coffins spoke a language of domination, each line and circle a chain meant to hold the dead in place. Silas had written of weaknesses and sins, but his true obsession was mastery over flesh, over blood, over spirit. His daughters were sacrifices, not in devotion to God or tradition, but to his own twisted hunger for permanence. In binding them, he sought to make the Fairchild name eternal, etched into soil and bone. Their silence was his monument. But the silence was ending. Nathaniel felt it first as a vibration in the earth, subtle yet constant, like a heart beating beneath the ground. The air thickened, carrying the taste of iron and ash until each breath felt borrowed. The forest pressed closer, its branches creaking though no wind stirred. From the graves rose a sound, not a voice, but the suggestion of one, layered and overlapping, as though 7 whispers strained to speak at once. He stumbled back, clutching the ledger, but the symbols within the coffins glimmered faintly, lines of old carvings catching the lantern's light in ways they should not. The wood groaned, and in that moment Nathaniel understood, the bindings were not meant to last forever. They were weakening, or perhaps his very presence, his blood spilled into the carvings, had loosened the seal. Silas's control was unraveling. The soil shifted. Fingers of bone pressed through cracks, fragile yet purposeful. A jawbone tilted upward, teeth bared in a grin that had nothing of joy. One grave trembled, then another, until the clearing itself seemed to heave with restless motion. The air filled with the faintest strains of sound, a note from Clara's piano, a child's laugh, a sob cut short, fragments of life returning in echoes. Nathaniel dropped to his knees, horror and awe mingling in his veins. The curse was not legend, not metaphor. It lived. It endured. And now, freed from the bindings of the patriarch, it stirred, searching for release. The estate above would not remain silent much longer. Its walls would breathe again. Its halls resound with footsteps that belonged to no living soul. In the dark, Nathaniel realized the truth that Blackwood Hollow had always feared but never spoken aloud. The Fairchild Daughters had not been buried to rest. They had been buried to wait. And now, after generations of silence, their waiting was over.